Dr. Robert's psychedelic scholarship includes education, religion, psychedelic medicine, 2 volumes, the first textbook-style book in psychedelics since 1967, and in the liberal arts, The Psychedelic Future of the Mind, his current book. Since 1981, he's taught the world's first psychedelic course listed in a university catalog. He's a founding member of MAPS, a co-founder of the Council on Spiritual Practices, CSP.org, and originated this celebration of Bicycle Day.
I'd like to invite you to go on an adventure with me, an idea adventure. We're going to be looking at a series of ideas are about psychedelics, not so much as those that are produced by psychedelics. And when we look at that, we're going to be looking at a view of our psychedelic community and trying to place it in a larger framework. We'll be looking at the nature of the human mind and new ways to develop our minds, and we'll look at what it means to be a human and adding what it means to be a human. My life project is how to bring psychedelics to the general community beyond these walls. The medical perspective is basically the one that everybody knows about, and everybody in this room, or almost everybody, is familiar with psychotherapy that uses psychedelics. So that's the psychotherapeutic use of psychedelics. In religion, there's the entheogenic use of psychedelics. And the questions that we need to ask are, how will our current or religious organizations adapt to psychedelics? So that's sort of the entheogenic use. We also have the popular culture use, and this is one of them that we're in right now. So this includes meetings like this, bulletins, movies, all these sort of things that are popular culture, the sort of things like the Boom Festival that we just heard about this morning. That's the popular culture part of it. And finally, the 2 I'm going to be addressing are the intellectual use of psychedelics. This is the theme idea that we're going to be talking about. Like a good voyage, this is where we start out. It'll lead us various ways through intellect, business, and possibilities of the human mind. And like all good cultures, we'll come back to the place that we started and see the place with a new understanding. There's our map of the psychedelic community. We're going to be looking at the 2 at the far end. I think this is the areas where the most work are needed right now. One of the ideas to start with is this idea of consilience. This is one of the major league games in intellectual processes. The idea is to build a scaffolding of ideas, starting with subatomic particles and going up through levels of complexity, even to philosophy and theology. The idea is an old one. Wilson, the well-known biologist, calls it consilience and named his book Consilience after this. So what do psychedelics have to say about consilience? Actually, they are extremely good for consilience. If we introduce a drug at the lower level, and of course that's what we're doing with a psychedelic drug, it then has effects all the way up these other levels. Now, one of the ways to build this scaffolding of ideas is to have an input at one level and an output at another level. And this is exactly what psychedelics do. Wilson mentions this in his book, Consilience. Benny Shannon, who's one of my favorite writers in this field. Shannon is a cognitive psychologist who teaches at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He went on a vacation to Brazil, and you can guess the rest of the story. When a cognitive psychologist runs into ayahuasca, he says, "What's going on here?" So he actually had quite a few sessions, interviewed Brazilians, North Americans, and Europeans about their sessions, and has an excellent book, Antiquities of the Mind. Absolutely stunning book. If I were to say, this is what other disciplines should do, I would say, look at what Benny Shannon has done. What did Shannon discover? As a cognitive psychologist, he found out that he had experiences that didn't fit in with the fundamentals of cognitive psychology. What I think he has stumbled on, and this is one of these clues to follow up, is a way to produce new paradigms experimentally. We tend to think of them as a sort of arriving as anomalies occur and they get swept under the rug, and then people start paying attention to them. But by giving people different things to do with their minds, we will come up with new paradigms. Now, notice what he's developing here at the same time is a new type of research in which the investigator's mind is the variable. In almost every study, we assume that people should use their ordinary default state of consciousness. But that we are not stuck with that state. We can do all these various studies by varying the states of consciousness. Actually, I call them mind-body states. For this use, I use mind-body. I think the word consciousness is too confusing. I want to talk about 3 ways of enhancing cognition. One is improving current skills and processes. This is what you usually hear about when college students are taking Adderall. They want to study better, they want to score better, they want to remember. These are the current processes that are hopefully made more powerful. Yes, there are new questions and new ideas, which is another type. And Benny Shannon's work asks a new type of question. What happens when we change the researcher's mind? What experiments can we do in which the researcher's mind is the variable? And probably everybody in this room, or almost everybody, has had that experiment yourself. And you know you think differently about things. Now, that's not to say that everything you have on a psychedelic experience, every idea, is a good and valuable one. But that makes it no different from an ordinary state, right? Not all of our ideas we have on an ordinary state are good and valuable ones. The last one that has a star on it, we'll get to a little bit later. But there are the 3 very different types of cognitive enhancement. Almost all the work so far is just on the first type. In biology, the small sample size held research back until Terry Mullis invented the PCR technique, which actually sort of grows the sample larger and makes different kinds of biology possible. He had this idea, he said, not while he was taking psychedelics, but when he was taking psychedelics, he learned to visualize, and he carried that ability from the psychedelic state back to the normal state. Now, when you try to remember a dream, you know how that is. You know you dreamt, you can't remember it, and then suddenly it'll download. So the question of transferring ideas from state to state is open to experiment, and it can be done, as he shows here. The second one is a business. When the little hardware company was starting off, there were lots of language companies around, and they're all trying to get the business. And this guy named Bob Wallace attributes an idea he had to his psychedelic experiences, and he said, let's give it away and ask people to pay for it. And that real nice hippie idea, right? You mentioned Dormouse. I mean, that's the sort of thing that comes out in the book that Dormouse said. And so they gave it away, and enough people paid for it so that they were able to pay their salaries. But because they gave it away, hundreds of thousands and millions of people started to use it, and it became the standard in the field. I call those micrograms for Microsoft. That's how Microsoft got going, thanks to the psychedelic insight. Professional problem solving, there's the work of Louis Harman, and Jim Fadiman mentions this in his book, Guide to Psychedelics. They had professors, professionals, designers, engineers who were stuck on problems, try to solve them. They gave them either mescaline or LSD in guided sessions, and they came out with a long list of solutions that were accepted by the clients and accepted by scientific papers and so forth. And finally, psychotherapy we know about. Now, the important thing to notice here is not these individual things. This lets us ask a different kind of question, okay? And this question, I think, is one of the hottest questions that I think of that can go on, and that is, how does problem solving vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? There are a lot of definitions of intelligence. I like the one that Howard Gardner uses, solving problems or producing goods of value in society. Those 4 boxes that we just saw on the last slide are good examples of solving problems that provide goods to society. How does intelligence vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? Now, there are a couple types of variables. One is the default state, ability gets weaker or stronger, and the other is there may be analogs in other states. Are there other types of intelligence in other states? Certainly in the arts and perception, we see other types of perception in other states. It's not just a matter of intensifying our ordinary state. How does problem solving vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? And we can plug in problem solving and those 4 that we've just mentioned, science, business, and so forth. Notice that I've emphasized the word experimental here. Some of the things they found is that when people have mystical experiences, and it's important to remember it's not the drug that produces these effects. The drug produces the mystical experience, and the mystical experience produces the effect. So the drug is a way of getting to the mystical experience. Of those who had mystical experiences, 11% said it was the single most important experience in their life, 58% the top 5. Similarly, for spiritual significance, for altruism, and for open-mindedness. So in these 4 boxes, we've got a philosophical question of meaningfulness that can be studied experimentally. This isn't a matter of sitting down and reading what some philosopher said in an armchair. It's a matter of doing experimental philosophy. Spiritual significance, experimental religion comes out of this. And we can vary people's religious experience thanks to psychedelics and other spiritual technologies. Altruism, social relations, is now open to experimental research. And open-mindedness, a person's psychological positions and traits are open to experimental research. This blows the roof off the social sciences, and not only the social sciences. Now, some of these slides have a lot of words on them, and the way to look at these is not to try to look at every word, but look at them the way you would look at the shape of a tree. You don't look at every leaf and every branch. This is one of the big get the gist slides. Here we have this question with all these things inserted into it, and a lot more. This opens up incredible openings to look at things. Language, how does language vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? You know, perfect question. And the big one is that little et cetera down at the end. Think whatever you're mostly interested in and plug it into this. And ask how much do we as a culture know about that answer? And probably the answer is going to be not much, but we now can look at it. This is from the pharmacology of LSD. Each of the little ovals represents an area that the authors of this book see as influenced by psychedelics. It's an extremely rich area. So all those ovals, botany, biology, sociology, theology, are influenced by psychedelics and can be researched, I would say, with psychedelics. But we can do more than that. I think we can do the same thing with the humanities. And I propose we start the experimental humanities. This is not to replace the humanities, but to enrich them. So up at the top, film criticism and lit criticism. I've written an analysis of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs using Groff's 4-level of the mind, with particularly the perinatal level. Huxley's Island has moksha, so this is psychedelics incorporated into fiction. Huxley is an author of ideas, so it's really sort of an idea fiction. And over at the end is Pink Floyd The Wall. After this semester is over, I want to do a Groffian analysis. See it. First read Groff and then see it. It is just an astounding movie. Down below that, article that has to do with rhetoric and languages. Stan Groff has written a fascinating article called The Perinatal Roots of Wars, Revolutions, and Totalitarianism. Again, noting that when leaders from Alexander the Great to Hitler try to get people to go to war, they use birth imagery. Now, they don't consciously use birth imagery, but a good speaker has a sense of the unconscious of himself and can project it off into other people and activate it. Riedlinger has a beautiful little analysis of Jean-Paul Sartre, saying that a lot of his ideas and general orientation toward the world came from his mescaline experience. Mythology, Joseph Campbell and Stan Groff were close friends, and in the last chapter of Myths to Live By, he says he has received a chapter of a book that turns out to be Realms of the Human Unconscious, now sold as LSD, Doorway to the Numinous. And that it agrees with his findings on mythology. Apples of Apollo, it's written by Carl Ruck, who is a biologist of the ancient Mideast and goes through a lot of Mideastern thought in the ancient world and attributes it, and particularly the myths and stories, to psychoactive plants. Hillman is an interesting history one. He was a biology major, got interested in classics, started to write his dissertation on psychoactive plants in ancient Greece and Rome. His advisor was so incensed that he refused to accept the dissertation until he dropped off. I mean, how would the ancient Greeks and Romans, those noble people, use psychoactive plants? One of the things we were doing is starting with an idea like consilience and then expanding it. We're here to talk about psychedelics, but we all know that psychedelics are a narrow piece of the psychoactive pie. Psychoactive drugs are one way of altering mind-body state, and there are lots of others. And if we're going to have a full view of the human mind, we have to understand and map our minds in every mind-body state, not just our ordinary awake state. And almost all research is done in our ordinary awake state. There's some nice research done on meditation now and some on dreams, but nothing compared to what's actually up there. This expands that question of how does X vary from mind-body state to mind-body state to include every one of these pieces of pie, and every one of these pieces is a collection of techniques. There are lots of types of meditation, lots of types of breathing technique, and so forth. So there are an enormous amount of things to look at. It means something different to be well-educated. To be well-educated is generally considered to use our ordinary awake mind-body state well. If we have all these other mind-body states, someone who's really well-educated should learn to use one or several mind-body states and the abilities that reside in those states. There are two big impediments to developing psychedelics, medically and intellectually. One is widespread public knowledge is not around, and the other, of course, is lack of funding. And I'm going to propose an idea now. It will sound strange at first, but I want to at least tickle your mind enough to think this might be the way to solve both problems at the same time. If we look at how funding works now, basically going to donors with a cup in the hand, we owe an enormous, huge debt to people who have been supporting psychedelics financially, not just because they're helping overcome PTSD or addictions or neuroses and psychoses, but because this is leading to, I think, that should be a great improvement in what it means to be a human and for human future. This particular donations go far beyond the research. Now, how can we raise $100 million for these groups? I don't mean $100 million divided. I mean $100 million for each one. We'll get to the numbers in a minute, as strange as that sounds. See what I mean by an idea adventure. Remember histograms when you're studying statistics? This is my histogram. Actually, units of consciousness should be a lot smaller, but I didn't want to make it so small you couldn't see it. If we're going to appeal to the second group of people, that is the population in general, one of the ways to appeal them is through money. And this is what I'm proposing. Founding a company with two centers, a therapy division and a personal growth division. There are all these areas that have been explored and are being explored with psychotherapy, so this is what the psychotherapy division would do. And then there are the personal growth centers. These are the things that I find most interesting, mainly because they have not been well addressed. This is the kicker, okay? To get people to invest in a new company, they're supposed to do something called due diligence. And this is knowing everything about the investment that is material, and that's the stuff we know. If you wondered how do you get your banker and your broker and your insurance man or the people in those industries or your neighbors interested in psychedelics, tell them there's a company that's going to develop the psychotherapeutic and personal growth aspects of psychedelics, and they should look into it as a possible investment. The SAMHSA survey of American drug use has about 30.7 million people who have either done psychedelics or have done MDMA, and I've cut out half the MDMA people because they've probably also done psychedelics. This is only in the United States. If 1% of those 300,000 people invested $5,000 each, this is $1.5 billion. What if it isn't 1%? What if it's 2% or 3%? And this doesn't include most pools of money. Mutual funds, business development corporations, venture investors. Here's our board of directors. This is the caption from the 1977 cartoon in the New Yorker. Instead of over on the side where it used to say a full view of the mind, it now says ingredients for cognitive invention. This I find the most scary and exciting part of this idea journey. I think of inventions as being a path of three I's. There's insight, that's the scientific discovery, implementation, and innovation. Usually what's looked at as the scientific research and the implementation, that's the psychotherapy in our case, but almost nothing is paid to an innovation. Now let's go back to this. In physics, there are the synthetic elements that are made in the laboratory. In chemistry, synthetic products. Plastic is the best example. There's the whole field of synthetic biology. My favorite is there's a graduate student at Harvard who's using yeast to make a precursor of LSD. Looking back at that pie shot of all the various mind-body psychotechnologies, can we combine them in ways that have never been combined before and produce synthetic states of consciousness? synthetic mind-body states, that is, states that have not been produced before. What happens if we have a new recipe? Let's say we take ayahuasca, sensory deprivation, and hypnosis, and use those at one time. Will we then produce mind-body states that have not been produced before? Almost all research, and that almost shouldn't be too strong, there's one variable that looks either meditation or one psychedelic drug or one breathing technique or, okay. Can we compose them in new ways? And what will we call the people who do that? You know, cranial designers, cognitive engineers, consciousness artists. There's some in the room. You are the people who are going to be doing this. Okay, this is a new profession that is emerging from putting together mind-body states in new ways. Just as we can write a very large number of apps for our electronic devices, can we write a very large number of apps for our minds? Apps are to devices as psychotechnologies are to minds. I think there's something like 370,000 apps now. Well, I don't think we're going to have that many mind-body states, but we've got an awful lot of ingredients to work with. So thank you for letting me talk about my favorite subject, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being such good listeners.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
In reaching the general public, should we let them know about these mind apps that are already being developed? Oh, absolutely. Richard Davison at University of Wisconsin is doing wonderful work in meditation. There's a lot going on, nowhere nearly as much as could be or should be, but these things are happening. I mean, look at a large part of the human potential movement that had yoga and breathing techniques. I mean, these are all mind-body psychotechnology.
During your idea journey, the thought that came to my mind is one way to jumpstart what you're imagining is to have some kind of expanded consciousness day.
There are so many directions to go. Those of you who go to professional conferences, submit papers on psychedelics. If you're a student and you have a term paper to write, if you have a skeptical professor, make it a question. Are there implications of psychedelics for blah, blah, blah? Or does blah, blah, blah discipline have anything to say about psychedelics? If you approach a professor with a question, they have a hard time turning it down. If you say, I'm going to tell you how to solve all sociological problems, you won't get very far. So that's definitely something to... Also, universities need, for example, endowed professorships. A professor, let's say, of mind-body studies in the arts, mind-body studies in music, mind-body studies in history. I mean, there are all these, and there can be some institutes. Let's say NYU could start an institute for mind-body studies in the humanities. And I'm saying mind-body studies to include all those pieces of the pie, not just the psychedelic. Or, of course, it could be just the psychedelic piece of the pie. I mean, there's so many directions to go. See, there are all these, how does blank vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? I mean, that's enough to keep probably 4 generations of universities busy. And when we get into composing new states, then all of those questions get re-asked for every one of those new states. Yeah, so there's no limit of stuff to do.
The risks and the public demonization of these substances. We've had a few deaths in recent months of people at festivals and so on. Isn't that a very substantial impediment to their acceptance?
Yes, and this is a reason that they should be done carefully. The sort of stuff they're doing at Bellevue and Johns Hopkins. It's sort of the equivalent of giving a 16-year-old kid keys and saying, okay, now go and drive, with no driving lessons. Yes, of course there are dangers. Of course, our ordinary state of consciousness produces lots of dangers too. I mean, these are not such pure and holy states that nothing bad could possibly happen in them.
In terms of mind apps, would you see that as including non-psychedelic pharmaceutical tweaks, like maybe a drug to enhance visual memory? If so, how would you go about trying to convince the FDA to create a framework for getting approval of drugs that are neither medical nor recreational?
The first answer is yes, all of those are possibilities. And the nice thing about starting a company, now the money that the company raises would be used to fund all these research places. See, this is the way new products are developed. Somebody comes up with something in the lab, they have a company to develop it. The money from the lab is used to develop the product or the service more completely, If it's a medical product, it then gets appealed to the FDA. I mean, it's a way of using the current situation, the current social structure, rather than trying to go against it. And you use it by, well, this is what's happening right now as psychedelic drugs, we're through with a lot of them, not all of them, through phase 1, through phase 2, and now in the big, expensive, difficult phase 3. And this is where you need hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, the donors have been great up to phase 2, but are there enough out there to consistently raise hundreds of millions of dollars? And it would have to be tested for every use. See, all those lists that were of psychotherapy would have to be tested separately. So the amount of money that's needed is enormous. On the other hand, if we raise $1.5 billion and apply to the FDA, that has a lot more clout than Dr. So-and-so in Paupa, Illinois, wanting to do some research. Now, also, this gets the attention of the investing and money public. Okay, and then they have to learn about this. And this is, I mean, if you've got Chase Bank and Morgan on your side, or Morgan Chase and Goldman on your side, and Fidelity, you make a big splash politically. And so this is that due diligence kicker. And I think that's the way to go, that's the reason to go on that, is to take advantage of the current ways of drug approval rather than, just make something yourself or you buy it from a friend and, get arrested for it. And these are the paths that are making progress. Notice then the speakers here and the speakers at other conferences like at MAPS are describing themselves moving along this general path. And the progress that's being made is along this general path, not illegal, unconscious paths.
Why would the substances have to be tested separately for each application? I thought you could prescribe off-label once it was approved for one application.
Well, once some psychological and medical conditions will have reactions to a psychoactive drug that others won't. So safety isn't as big an issue as it could be. The studies of starting the pilot tests, the testing of the concept. Also, what you do is you have your drug and you try it on a number of different medical conditions, find out where it's going to work best, and you also try different doses to find out what's the best dose for this particular condition. So those have to be done. And for each disease, and psychological diseases are, well, I may rub some doctors wrong. I think I'm much more complicated to work with and think about than physical diseases. Pardon me if you're a doctor and you don't want to disagree. I won't argue with you on that. But because of that, then you have to redo it. Okay, so if PTSD is treated with MDMA, the question is what else might be treated with MDMA, and show us the evidence. And the FDA is always show us the evidence. And this is the way to generate the evidence and pay for the extreme cost of the evidence. There's another question. Let me ask myself a question here. Some people sometimes ask, okay, where do I buy stock in this company? Okay, write a check, no less than 4 digits, give it to Neil. To make it a little easier, just make it out cash and give it to Neil, and he'll take good care of it. He knows how to run things. Thank you.